Coming up next on the Union Day will be a conversation with Bob Reynolds of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers Retired. Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. To begin with, how many years did you spend with the IAM?
Well, I've been a member in good standing with the machinist organization for a little over 42 years.
You started out in the railroad shops here and wound up as president of District 19, which basically made you the union's top railroad guy.
That's correct. I was the president and directing general chairman of our Railroad District Lodge 19, and we were primarily responsible for servicing all of our IFM members throughout the railroad industry within the United States and related industries, and that is companies that do business for the railroads.
Mm-hmm. Are you a Paducah native?
I was born in Louisville, Kentucky.
And came down here, and I believe you said before the show you worked on the river before you switched to rail.
I did. I went to work for a company that used to be here in Paducah, Hoagland Towing Company.
I remember them, yeah.
Started out in 1960 and then went to the railroad in 1964.
Now, the machinists, tell us about the history. The Machinist Union began as a craft union, and it sort of evolved into an industrial union, isn't that right?
It did. It started out as a craft organization. There was, in early May 1888, 19 railroad machinists in Atlanta, Georgia, founded the IFM.
Mm-hmm. And I believe somewhere back that one of the early IAM members helped start Labor Day, a parade in New York. McGuire, I think it was.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, there was a carpenter, and I must say I can't recall, but anyway, he was involved. One of the early machinists was involved in that. So you started out in the Paducah shops as an apprentice?
I did. I served a 4-year machinist apprentice.
Explain how that works, because that's kind of interesting, because the railroad shops, that's an industrial facility, but yet you were working as an apprentice, sort of a craft approach to this. How did that work?
That's right. Well, you have to understand, when I went to work for the railroad, which was the former Illinois Central at that time, they had an apprenticeship training program, but the only way you could hire on with the company as a journeyman machinist is that if you had served an IAFM 4-year apprenticeship with a railroad somewhere in the United States or with the Illinois Central. They would not hire people that had outside railroad experience as journeyman machinists. So I hired out as a machinist apprentice, which was a 40-day training period, 8 hours a day. And then you had classroom study, on-the-job training. And later on, we revised that training program so that it included technical school training as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the river, you worked on diesel engines?
I did. I was an engineer.
Well, are railroad locomotive engines similar to towboat engines?
Well, in some cases, they're identical. The EMD locomotives that they have EMD engines on them. And some of the inland waterway boats have those same type engines on them.
Mm-hmm. So how then did you rise up in union ranks as an officer? What made you decide to become a union officer, and what was your first office?
Well, when I hired out as a machinist apprentice, under the contract you had to have 120 days of service in order to qualify for a 5-day vacation period. And so the year that I went to work in 1964, I didn't really know if I had worked 120 days or not. So I went over and talked to the committeeman at that time that represented the people in the shop, if he could tell me if I would be entitled to a vacation in 1965. And he told me not to worry about it too much, that if I was entitled to it, they'd give me a vacation, and if I wasn't, well, they wouldn't assign me one. So I wasn't too happy about the kind of response that I had received, and so I was encouraged by some of the older IFM members there in the shop to attend the local lodge meetings and run for local chairman position, and which I did and was elected the following year.
How old were you then?
Well, at that time, I guess I was 23 years old. So that my first position was as a local chairman at the shop representing the other machinists.
Is that like a steward?
It's like a steward, that's right.
Yeah. So from there, where did you go?
Well, then I became president of the local lodge, Local Lodge 123. And I held both of those positions from then until 1978 when I was elected a full-time representative. And so I left the shop in 1978, served as a full-time representative in that capacity, working in various districts. We had a number of districts within the I of M at that time. Over the years, those districts were slowly consolidated until eventually we ended up with one railroad district representing all of our I of M members employed within the railroad industry within the United States. And I became the president and directing general chairman of that district in 1990.
Did you still live in Paducah while you were doing this?
Yes. Yes, I traveled extensively, but Paducah's always been home to me, so I always come back to Paducah.
What makes a good union officer at any level?
Well, first of all, I think to be a good union officer, you have to truly believe in the principles of unionism. That is, you have to believe that workers need to be treated with dignity and respect on the job, that they are entitled to a decent wage, decent insurance, a good pension. You have to believe that working class of people have a right to be heard in the workplace, that they should have a voice in establishing their conditions of employment. I think to be a good union officer or representative, though, you have to remember that you are serving the people. To represent someone is not an inherent right. No one is born with the right to represent other people. That is an honor and a privilege that the members bestow upon an individual to represent them. And so, to me, I always consider that as a sacred trust. And so you never want to do anything but your very best to try to make sure that they're serviced and represented in a way and at a standard that they're entitled to through the payment of their dues and their membership. They put their trust and confidence in you.
Now, the machinists, of course, there are railroad machinists, there are factory machinists, there are one of your long-term international presidents, William Wimpesinger, who I had the pleasure of meeting many years ago. He was an auto mechanic.
Right.
So it's a very diverse union. What else is part of the machinists today?
Well, the machinists, as you say, we're very diverse insofar as the various industries that we're in. I can't hardly think of any industry really in the United States. Machinists, they're automobile mechanics, they're truck mechanics, they're aerospace mechanics, they're technical people, engineers. We represent them. We represent healthcare workers, manufacturing. Like I said, I just can't hardly think of any segment of our society that you wouldn't find some I of M members in them.
The future of labor in the United States, there is a group that's called the Change to Win Coalition that had broken away from the national AFL-CIO and started off on their own. Do you see that as a danger or to the union movement in the future?
I do, absolutely. I was disappointed in that action. I'm sure that the leaders of those particular organizations felt that what they were doing were probably in their best interest or the best interest of their group. But I believe that the strength of organized labor is unity. And as you know, the number of union people in this country have declined over the years. Not because I think of people's dissatisfaction with organized labor, and I'd like to make that clear. I think that what's happened to union jobs in this country is that companies have taken those jobs that are the better jobs in this country for the most part and moved them overseas where they can take advantage of low wages, no environmental or very little environmental regulations. And as a result of that, people in this country that's had good jobs, union jobs, have seen their jobs shipped overseas.
There's a book. It's called Bowling Alone. And it's written by a sociologist who says that people don't do things in groups or organizations anymore. And it talks about all sorts of, including unions. Hardly anyone goes to the monthly union meeting. You might get 10, 15, 20% turnout. That's a problem. How do you keep people engaged? How do you get people to come to the monthly union meetings?
Well, I think probably what you're talking about is a problem for not only labor organizations, but many
All
organizations.
organizations. And
I
that's what
noticed
the
that
book.
when you go to a church, that there's many empty spaces on the pews.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean that the people that's not attending church are bad people. It's just that they feel comfortable in their environment,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't either feel the need to attend church, or maybe it's a Masonic lodge. It could be a labor organization.
Well, this book,
But-
the title itself, the man, there was a bowling league, and I believe it was in New Jersey, that had been going for 50 years. Well, it disappeared. Well, he was curious, why? And then he began to look at civic clubs, women's clubs, church groups, unions, and it's all across the board. So it's a real societal problem. So how do you get them back into the union halls, meeting every month?
That's really you might say, a $64 question.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a lot of people if would like to have the answer to that question, and I'm not sure that I would have the answer to that question. But one of the things that I do know is that people, when it comes to unions, if they're pretty satisfied with the way things are going on the job, in the plant, in the shop, whatever it might be, then they're generally pretty content to stay home and let their officers and representatives and a few other members go down and take care of the regular monthly business of the local lodge. But if you have issues concerning their conditions of employment, if the company is violating the contract, or if there's a proposed change in the contract, if there's something of interest to the people, I find that most of the members will take the time to come down, become informed on the issues, and make an informed decision as they cast their ballots for or against whatever the issues may be that they may be voting on. But as far as coming down, I think that we have a society today, if you think about it, there's literally millions of children playing soccer, softball, baseball, basketball. People are engaged today. We have a very active society. And as a result of that, I think that people are pressed to find the time to do everything that they feel like they need to do in the day. And so the things that they think that someone else can take care of, or they don't have to do, well, then I think they just kind of defer that until such time as it becomes a number one issue with them.
Mm-hmm. In talking to union presidents of various unions, you're absolutely right. People will show up when there's a crisis, an issue, something important. But what these presidents tell me is, if you showed up every month, there might not be a problem or a crisis. I think that's the tough part, is getting people to participate. I think what frustrates a lot of them is that this involves your job, your employment, your livelihood. And I think that's the tough part.
Well, I have to tell you, in my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, and not a judgment on any particular labor organization or any particular officers or representatives within my own organization or anyone else, but I do believe that there's a breakdown today in communication in the workplace between workers and their representatives. I think that more time should be given to making sure that workers understand what's going on, that involves them, that it involves their family, that involves the community. You know, everything is connected. And I think that, I know when I was in the shop, at that point in time, I would dare say that regardless of the crafting class that the employees may be affiliated with, there was probably not hardly a man or a lady in the shop that I didn't know them by their first name. And we used to have a lot of, discussions and communications, and so people were interested in what was going on, whether it was new work coming into the shop or the stage of the work that was being performed, what the goals were. We always had some kind of programs to discuss, and we used to have some very active participation by a large number of the members at every local lodge meeting. And we used to have annual picnics, where we bring the families together. And people who socialize together, people that know one another better, they're much more inclined to share information, discuss issues with one another, and participate in meetings.
In talking to officers of craft unions, part of their apprenticeship program is union heritage, union history, to understand what their unions came from. In talking to industrial unionists, you don't see as much of that. One industrial unionist was telling me, said that when a young person gets hired at his plant, in the personnel office, they learn what salary they make, which is a good salary, good benefits, good vacations, and they think that the company just gave this to them out of the goodness of their heart. And he said where he thinks unions are missing the boat is not calling that person aside, giving him a pamphlet or something, say, look, these were union won wages and benefits and vacations.
I totally agree with him. And I think it's imperative. And I can remember again when I was in the shop, and I used to encourage as a general chairman or as a president, directing general chairman of our railroad district, I used to encourage local lodge officers and committeemen that every time you bring a new member in, that you take the time to give him the material and to go over it with him and to understand that all of his conditions of employment are as a direct result of collective bargaining. And I know I used to, as I would go through the shops and talk to people, I would point out to them, if you think about it, if you look back, every time there's been a change in your condition of employment, every time, good or bad, but almost invariably always good, it's been as a direct result of collective bargaining. When your wages went up, it was because someone sat down with management and negotiated a new contract, improvements in your health care program, in your pension plan. But you know what's important to workers, Barry, is not just the wage rate. It's the conditions of employment that they have every day on the job site, how they're treated. How clean is the work area? What's the attitude of their supervisor? What's the attitude of their coworkers? When you go in, you spend more time on a job probably than any other single location in your life, other than maybe at home, in bed at night. And when you think about that, it's important that you have a good environment to go into. And so I've always felt like that it was mutually beneficial for the company and its employees to work together to try to have the best work environment possible. At the same time, I know the company, as stockholders, they have to make a profit, and I've always tried to recognize that. But the employees make a great contribution to the success of any company. And I certainly believe that they're entitled, as I said, to some decent conditions of employment that enables them to give their family not only the necessities of life, but some of the other things that they'd like to have.
A mutual friend of ours, Larry Sanderson of the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Union, says over and over again to his brothers and sisters in the union and anyone else who'll care to listen, politics is awfully important in this equation. There is, the United States, a great disconnect between many citizens and politics. If we have a 50% turnout in an election, we think that's something to celebrate. You see that in union ranks too. There are thousands of union members who don't vote, not even registered to vote. And not only that, they are split by conservative, anti-union politicians who appeal to what Larry calls the 3 Gs, God, guns, and gays. How do you deal with union members who vote on those hot-button social issues and not union issues?
Well, I think that you have to address their hot-button issues, as you just said, as well as the labor issues. You have to try to convince people that they need to look at the broad aspect of society and how they fit into society and what it means not only to themselves, but to their children and even their grandchildren. Because the society that we build today, that we develop, is what we're going to pass on to the next generation. And it's been my experience that while people may be caught up in single issues, as you say, it can be God, it could be guns, it could be gays, when you talk to them, you can make them realize that when they just give a little thought to life, that there's many other issues that influence them. When you talk about guns and you say, well, how many times a day do you use a gun? Do you use a gun to make your living with? Or do you use a gun for pleasurable events such as hunting or target practicing or something like that? Well, when they get to looking at it and they get to thinking about it, they get to thinking, well, you know, guns are important, but if I don't have a job and I don't make a decent wage, then I can't afford a gun. I can't afford to take a hunting trip. I can't afford a boat to go fishing in. And so then you start trying to talk to them about labor issues, politicians. The railroad industry, above all industries, have probably been affected by politics as much as any other segment of workers in our society because of the Railway Labor Act. And over a period of years, I became very frustrated, to say the least, with the process, because under the Railway Labor Act, which was enacted in 1938. In 1938, the Railway Labor Act was enacted, and it was to prevent major disputes, meaning strikes, between railroad employees and railroads over what they referred to as minor disputes. Minor disputes being a dispute involving the interpretation and application of any existing contract. It was never intended to prevent the employees from being able to strike if necessary to obtain a new contract. Unfortunately, over the years, the federal courts kept enjoining unions and keeping them from being able to strike the railroad industry at any time under any circumstances, until it has become almost virtually impossible for railroad workers to be able to strike any railroad over any issue. I know in my last experience as an active representative of the machinist organization, we served notice nationally on the railroads in 1999 to revise our existing contracts. When I retired on June 1st of 2005, we still had not been able to obtain a new contract. Now, people will tell you, well, contracts in the railroad industry never expire, and they don't under the Railway Labor Act. They're amendable. But at the same time, the Railway Labor Act was never intended, and it plainly provides that once you go through a certain procedure that's set up by the Act, that railroad workers would be able to withhold their services if necessary to get a contract. But as I said, the federal courts and Congress have prevented the railroad workers from doing that. And if you go through all the processes, you go through all the legal steps, and then you get down to the point of being able to strike, Congress will pass some kind of a public law that will impose an agreement on the railroads and its workers to prevent an interruption of service in the railroad industry.
So that's politics.
So that's politics, and that's why it's so important that you try to make sure that you elect people that understands the issues that affect you in the workplace. Whether that's a federal law. The Railway Labor Act is a federal law. Mm-hmm. The Railroad Retirement Act is a federal law. Changes to that pension system. In other words, at one time, railroad workers could retire at age 60 with 30 years of service. Then that was revised, and you had to be 62 with 30 years of service in order to get a full pension. Now, as a result of some negotiations between rail labor and the railroad industry, we were able to convince Congress to rewrite the railroad retirement system, and today railroad workers can retire at age 60 with 30 years of service. But again, it took legislation in order to make that change. So it's very important, critically important, that workers understand who they're voting for, what the issues are, and what the candidates' positions are on those issues that's so vital to them and their family.
In the 3 minutes we have left, let's go back and talk about the future. There's a book, another book out called Thomas Friedman, the Flat Earth. Is that something like that? Gosh, it's terrible to call a book and can't remember. Anyway, and it talks about globalization, outsourcing of jobs. You know, you got a computer problem in the United States, you call a toll-free number and you get a guy in India. How will labor address globalization as well as outsourcing in the future? Because it's going to continue and continue and continue, apparently.
Well, Barry, I think the only way that labor can address it is through the political process. This is an extremely important issue. And
I think the book is called The Earth is Flat.
Yeah,
I hope I've
well,
got that right. That's terrible. Anyway, go ahead. Thomas Friedman was the author.
all I can say is, if you remember what, centuries ago when people thought the world was flat, they were afraid to sail because they were afraid of falling off the edge. Well, if the world is truly that flat, I'm afraid a lot of workers are going to fall off the edge, because what they're doing is that they're, in a sense, they're just simply pitting one worker against another. They've done it here in the United States. And they're saying that either you give us concessions, wages, health care costs, pension reform, or we're just going to move the work. Well, when you give them everything that you can give them, they'll still move the work, because you can't compete. American workers cannot compete with labor in China, in Southeast Asia, in India, in Mexico, in South America, in places like this where you have large masses of people. There's no industry. And so labor is all they have to offer. And so if you move industry there, you have literally thousands of people that's going to line up for those jobs. And so, you know, the only way that organized labor can address that issue is to try to make sure that our politicians enact some kind of fair trade laws. You know, there's a big difference in free trade and fair trade. We know that. You know that. Everybody else knows that. And, you know, they talk about, well, it brings the price of all these products and services down if we have this world economy. It doesn't really bring the prices down, but it is bringing the standard of living down. And eventually, you know, the question is, who's going to be able to afford to buy any of these products and services?
A woman, a steel worker in a plant up elsewhere in Western Kentucky, was telling me her plant was shut. They moved it to a cheap labor country, and she says, who's going to buy all these televisions and things they're bringing into the country if we don't have these good paying jobs? And I think that's the point
That's right.
you were talking about too. Maybe you can come back later, we can talk about this book if I can get the title right. I'm so embarrassed. But it's interesting, the whole, this globalization thing, it's an important topic, and we are out of time. My guest today was Bob Reynolds of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. I'm Barry Craig. We'll see you next time.